standard song, a la George Gershwin or Rodgers and Hart. I mean...
Imagine the scene. Los Angeles, 1979. Backstage at the legendary Troubadour is alive with sound and movement. Guitars wail through soundcheck, glasses clink, and rock icons drift down the hallway as if walking through their own temple. Then suddenly, chaos. A young assistant bursts into the promoter's office, face pale and breathless. Linda Ronstadt has just walked out of the green room, again. And the reason? Just one name. Not hers, not the Eagles, his. One glance at that name on the performance list, and Linda quietly stood up, walked out, and said nothing. The silence that lingered behind her was so heavy, it seemed to swallow the room whole. 4 years afterward, no one truly knew what had happened that night. Linda never spoke of it. No complaints, no scandals, no blame. She appeared before the public calm, proud, and utterly composed. But after decades of silence, Linda Ronstadt finally broke it. In a rare and candid interview, she revealed 7 names she could never forgive, the people who wounded her pride, challenged her artistry, and exposed the darker side of the music industry. What surprised everyone was that the list was nothing like they expected. These weren't petty grudges or fleeting rivalries. They were stories that helped define an entire era, where power, betrayal, and quiet revenge intertwined beneath the blazing lights of rock and roll. And the most shocking part? Some of those names once stood closest to her. The first, a drummer who rose from obscurity, lifted by Linda's support, given his very first break by her hand. But once fame arrived, he turned his back, trampling the very path she had helped him build. He was the man who once called himself the heartbeat of the band, yet forgot who gave him his first rhythm. Before the Eagles became rock legends, Don Henley was just Linda Ronstadt's drummer and backup singer, the man she once helped bring into the light for the very first time. In the early 1970s, Linda was the rising star, selling out theaters from coast to coast. Henley, back then, was the quiet drummer sitting in the shadows, quietly riding the reflection of her success. It was Linda who gave him that first real chance, the opportunity that set everything in motion. But once the Eagles took flight, everything changed. Henley was no longer the humble musician she once knew. As the band's fame grew, so did his ego, and gratitude slowly turned into pride. The band that had once opened for Linda now strutted down Sunset Boulevard as if they owned it. Henley, more than anyone, carried himself like the self-crowned king of Laurel Canyon, distant, untouchable, and indifferent to the woman who had helped him rise. The breaking point came in 1975. Backstage at the Universal Amphitheater, Henley made a remark that Linda would never forget. He mocked her artistic direction, sneering that she should stick to singing covers and leave the songwriting to real artists. Those words didn't just offend her, they erased everything she had fought for with passion, perseverance, and raw talent. But Linda didn't lash out. She didn't argue. She simply turned, revoked his tour credentials on the spot, and walked away. No warning. No second chances. Rumors spread fast through the industry. Everyone knew Henley's ego had spiraled out of control. Friends and colleagues whispered about cocaine-fueled tantrums, selfish decisions, and the sharp words he'd throw behind closed doors. For Linda, the deepest wound wasn't betrayal, it was disrespect. In private, she would later describe him with a single, haunting phrase: a climber who lost his soul chasing fame. But Don Henley wasn't the only one who crossed the line. The next clash didn't happen quietly backstage, it happened live, right in front of an audience. A drunken frontman, a stolen microphone, and a moment of humiliation so raw that Linda Ronstadt would never forget it. It was the night Jim Morrison went too far. 1968. The summer of love had come and gone, but its chaos lingered in the air. The Doors were untouchable, setting every stage ablaze, while Linda Ronstadt, a young woman with a fierce voice, was still fighting to carve out her place in a world ruled by men. That night, at a private after-party near Whiskey A Go Go, legends and outlaws mingled freely. No one could have predicted what would happen when Jim Morrison spotted Linda. He was already several drinks in, shirt half unbuttoned, swaggering through the crowd with that wild, magnetic arrogance. And then, in a blur of ego and intoxication, Morrison suddenly pulled Linda on stage. No warning. No permission. It wasn't charming. It wasn't spontaneous. It was reckless. Right there, in front of everyone, he leaned in and tried to kiss her. Linda reacted on instinct, stepping away. Morrison stumbled, crashing into the microphone stand, nearly taking the whole setup down with him. Gasps. Stares. Whispers. The room froze. No one knew whether to laugh or stay silent. No camera ever caught the moment, but the story lived on, whispered backstage, retold on late-night radio, becoming an underground legend that refused to fade. Morrison never apologized. In fact, he made it worse. Months later, during a radio interview, he mocked her, calling Linda sweet but spineless, dismissing her as harmless, forgettable. Linda, true to form, didn't respond publicly. No outrage. No statement. But behind closed doors, her words cut like glass. A brilliant wreck, a man who carried both brilliance and destruction wherever he went. To Linda, Jim Morrison wasn't just a reckless showman, he was the embodiment of toxic masculinity, the kind that sought to dominate every corner of the music industry. But if Morrison's actions left a scar, the next betrayal cut far deeper. It didn't come from a drunken mistake or a stolen kiss, it came from a friend, someone she believed stood beside her, until ideals collided with ego, and that friendship shattered beyond repair. That man was Neil Young. It was 1976. A benefit concert for farm workers had gathered some of the biggest names in rock. Among them stood two artists known not just for their voices, but for their convictions: Linda Ronstadt and Neil Young. On stage, they appeared united, bound by purpose, passion, and belief. But once the lights hit, the harmony began to crack. Backstage, tension simmered. Neil started dismissing Linda's input, rejecting her setlist suggestions, blocking her from performing certain songs, and criticizing her sound for being too commercial. Then, after the show, he took it even further. He told the press that Linda wasn't built for protest. The message was unmistakable. She wasn't authentic enough for the cause. Linda left the venue in tears. It wasn't just an insult, it was a betrayal. A betrayal from someone she admired, someone she believed stood for the same ideals. To be dismissed as hollow by a fellow activist, that wound cut far deeper than anything a critic could ever write. That night marked a turning point for Linda Ronstadt. From that moment on, no matter how noble the cause, she refused to share a stage with Neil Young again. Behind closed doors, she described him with words that would linger for years. Loud in message, cruel in execution. To Linda, his activism rang hollow when paired with such arrogance. And if that wound scarred her personally, the next one would shatter her artistically. Because the next betrayal didn't happen behind the scenes, or through careless words to the press, it happened in the middle of a studio session, before a room full of musicians, where Linda Ronstadt's confidence was stripped away with a single, cold line. When genius turns to cruelty, Frank Zappa. The meeting between Frank Zappa and Linda Ronstadt in 1974 carried the promise of something legendary. Zappa, eccentric, unpredictable, the mad genius of experimental rock. Linda, versatile, fearless, and vocally unmatched. On paper, their collaboration should have redefined boundaries. In reality, it unraveled within hours. It started with promise. Linda was genuinely excited to record one of Zappa's songs. But once they entered the studio, the atmosphere shifted. Zappa dismissed her creative suggestions with a smirk, calling her voice too clean. He accused her of watering down his work, turning raw art into something that sounded like a car commercial. The tension reached its peak during a live rehearsal. Mid-session, Zappa raised his hand, stopping the band cold. Silence filled the room. And then, in front of everyone, he sneered. This is what happens when you hand real music to a pop singer. No one moved. No one spoke. Linda didn't argue or fight back. She simply gathered her things, walked out, humiliated, hurt, and finished. She never came back. And true to her nature, she never spoke publicly about it. Her silence said everything. Those who knew her best still remember her words. Frank Zappa, brilliant but brutal. I respected his mind, but I could never trust him again. Clashes with difficult artists were one thing. But the next wound went far deeper. Because the next betrayal didn't come from a studio or a stage, it came from someone she once called family. A fellow pioneer who turned his back on her, just when she needed him most. The Laurel Canyon Fallout. David Crosby. In the golden glow of Laurel Canyon, Linda Ronstadt and David Crosby were more than collaborators. They were kindred spirits. They shared stages, studios, and a deep belief in the countercultural ideals that shaped an era. Crosby's soaring harmonies and Linda's fearless, genre-defying voice rose on the same revolutionary tide. For a time, their bond seemed unbreakable. But by 1978, that harmony began to fall apart. During a recording session for a joint project, Linda requested a simple key change, one that suited her range better. Crosby refused, brushing her off with a cold remark. "You should learn to adapt." What should have been a small disagreement spiraled quickly out of control. Voices rose, tempers flared, and within days, word spread across the canyon. Soon, the story hit the press, and the once harmonious partnership became one of Laurel Canyon's most talked-about feuds. Then, Crosby went too far. In an interview with Rolling Stone, he dismissed Linda as manufactured, implying she was more image than artistry. For Linda, a woman who had built her career on instinct, honesty, and raw vocal power, it wasn't just an insult. It was a betrayal. But she didn't retaliate. No angry interviews, no on-stage remarks. Her silence spoke louder than any rebuttal. Behind the scenes, however, Linda made her stance clear. Crosby's name was banned from conversation within her circle. Her band was told not to mention him. His songs were scrubbed from her set lists. In Linda's world, David Crosby ceased to exist. To her, he hadn't just betrayed a friendship. He had betrayed the spirit of Laurel Canyon itself, the sacred bond of authenticity and artistic freedom they once shared. In private, she spoke of him as a warning, proof that even the brightest minds could be swallowed whole by ego, addiction, and fame. Yet if Crosby's betrayal wounded her personally, the next one would be colder, sharper. A public attack, where punk wit turned to venom. The provocateur this time, Elvis Costello. It was 1979, and Cleveland pulsed with anticipation. A massive music festival had drawn the biggest names in rock, legends and rising stars alike. At the top stood Linda Ronstadt, commanding, confident, and at the peak of her power. Every eye was on her, until the ridicule began. The punk provocation, Elvis Costello. Amid the bright lights of that 1979 music festival, while the crowd's gaze was fixed on Linda Ronstadt, one pair of eyes watched differently, sharp, defiant, and laced with arrogance. They belonged to Elvis Costello, the new punk provocateur. Smart, cynical, and unafraid to tear down the icons who came before him. But no one could have anticipated how cruel his next move would be. Surrounded by reporters, Costello smirked and delivered his verbal dagger. Her music sounds like background noise for brunch. It wasn't just a jab, it was a public humiliation. The comments spread like wildfire, splashed across headlines and whispered through every green room in the country. Linda, hurt but composed, confronted him backstage, hoping for an explanation, maybe even an apology. Instead, she found only ice. Costello, reportedly drunk and defiant, met her gaze, threw out another cutting remark, and walked away, utterly unrepentant. From that moment, Linda never looked back. To her, Elvis Costello was more than a rude musician. He embodied something darker, something she despised about the shifting music scene. He was the face of a new kind of artist. Sharp-minded but cold-hearted, endlessly critical yet empty of empathy. Not rebellious, just cruel for the sake of attention. In his defiance, Linda saw no soul, only ego. And yet, even that bitterness paled in comparison to the final heartbreak on her list. Because the last name wasn't a reckless rocker or a swaggering upstart. It was someone whose voice should have blended perfectly with hers, a partnership that seemed destined. But behind studio doors, that dream dissolved quietly into disaster. Perfection or control? Paul Simon's cold dismissal. In 1982, the idea sounded flawless. Paul Simon, one of the most revered songwriters of his generation, teaming up with Linda Ronstadt, the reigning queen of fearless vocals. When news of their collaboration broke, fans and critics alike were thrilled. It seemed destined for greatness, a marriage of artistry and freedom. But what followed was a slow unraveling. From the very first rehearsal, the chemistry was off. Paul Simon dissected every note, interrupting takes to correct phrasing that needed no correction. He rewrote sections of the song without telling her, calling his changes suggestions. To Linda, those suggestions felt like cuts, small, sharp, deliberate. Later, she would describe the experience in one painful sentence. It felt like being scolded by a school principal. Every note she sang was analyzed, not appreciated. Every take met with criticism, not collaboration. Whatever spark might have existed was buried beneath ego and control. The song was never finished, shelved, forgotten, left to rot in silence. But for Linda, the wound went far beyond a lost recording. It wasn't about one song. It was about dignity, about being treated as less than the artist she was. A voice like hers deserved partnership, not authority. Instead of a collaborator, she found herself facing a dictator. That day, she made herself a quiet promise. She would never record with Paul Simon again. And with that final fracture, the silence surrounding Linda Ronstadt's 7 greatest betrayals began to unravel. 7 names. 7 scars. All hidden beneath decades of grace, until now. Because behind every harmony lies a story no one hears, until someone finally decides to tell it. So why did Linda stay silent all those years? The answer is simple. She never chased gossip, never played the tabloid game. For decades, she let her voice speak for her. And now, in breaking that silence, she isn't seeking revenge, she's reclaiming truth. Linda Ronstadt's legacy was built not only on brilliance, but on endurance, surviving egos, betrayals, and an industry that rarely allowed women to be both talented and unapologetic. Because sometimes, the greatest power doesn't lie in the songs we sing, but in the silence we finally choose to break. Which story shocked you the most? And do you think Linda was right to stay silent all these years? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.